In May of 1905, in a ward at the Matawan Hospital for the Criminally Insane in New Jersey, an old woman was dying. She had been at Matawan for 15 years. Before that, she had spent time at Auburn Prison in upstate New York. Before Auburn, 18 years at Sing Sing. She had arrived in the American prison system in 1855, and she had never left it. By the time she reached Matawan, most of the people who had known her in the years before her incarceration were dead. Attendants sat with her. A clergyman was present. At some point before the end, someone asked her, as people had been asking her for 52 years, to say her name. She didn't. She died a few days later. Hospital records listed her age as 78. She had told staff she was 89. The question of which was accurate was never resolved, because the only person who knew with certainty did not say. Her name in the institutional record was Henrietta Robinson. Every person who had processed her, housed her, or attended to her for half a century had used those words. Henrietta Robinson. 2 words she had invented in the early 1850s in a small city on the Hudson River in New York, and worn ever since, through a murder trial, a death sentence, a commutation she had not wanted, and 5 decades of confinement that followed. Somewhere in the United States, or in Canada, there was a family that may have known who she was. They were never found, or they never came forward. The distinction matters less than it first appears. This is the case of the woman they called Henrietta Robinson. Troy, New York, in the early 1850s, was a manufacturing city of roughly 30,000 people. Iron foundries, textile mills, collar factories. The city had money, social hierarchy, and the particular self-seriousness of a place that had grown fast and wanted to be taken seriously. Established families lived alongside newly arrived workers. Respectability was something people tracked closely, because in a city that size, everyone was watching. Into this environment, at some point in the early part of the decade, came a woman calling herself Henrietta Robinson. She lived in a small cottage on the corner opposite a grocery store run by a man named Timothy Lanigan. She employed a servant girl and an elderly gardener. She was young, reportedly beautiful, evidently educated, and appeared to have independent means. No visible husband, no family, no occupation, and no apparent shortage of money. In a city that tracked such things, all of this was noticed. What was also noticed, by those who encountered her closely, was the behavior. She believed she was being persecuted. Not occasionally, not vaguely, actively, specifically, by forces she could name and locate. She accused a local gentleman of having stopped navigation on the Hudson River. She was found groping through darkened public buildings at night, searching for the police office, demanding protection for her home, which had not been touched. She wandered the streets of Troy in her nightgown, armed with a revolver, and presented it at the chest of a man she felt was observing her too closely. She appeared on an acquaintance's doorstep before dawn, having left home without dressing, and asked to borrow a dress, offering the explanation that she had simply forgotten her clothes. She drank, heavily, and often publicly. She had an account at Lanigan's grocery, which sold alcohol at a bar where the local neighborhood gathered in the evenings. She had been ejected from that bar more than once after drawing her revolver at some real or perceived insult. Her origins, when she offered them, contradicted themselves completely. Her father was an English lord who had expelled her from his castle. Her father was an Irish laborer from Vermont. A wicked stepmother had destroyed her prospects. She was the target of a conspiracy. She was a woman of rank who had been wronged. None of these accounts agreed with each other. All of them featured Henrietta Robinson at the center of a story too large for the city she was living in. On the morning of May 25, 1853, Henrietta Robinson crossed the street to Lanigan's store and purchased a quart of beer. She went home. 2 hours later, she came back and took a place at the bar. At some point, an argument broke out. The specifics were disputed. The result was not. Mrs. Lanigan asked her to leave. She left. At 1 o'clock, she returned for the third time that day. Timothy Lanigan and his wife were having dinner with Catherine Luby, a sister-in-law who had been staying with the family. Henrietta came in and was invited to join them. She sat down. When the meal was finished, she offered to treat the table to beer on her account. Mrs. Lanigan declined. Lanigan and Luby accepted. Henrietta asked for some sugar. She said it made the beer taste better. Lanigan went to draw the beer. There wasn't enough in the barrel for all the glasses, so he left the room to get more. When he came back, Henrietta had added the sugar to 2 of the tumblers, his and Luby's. She then announced that she had decided she didn't want any beer after all. She left the store and crossed back to her cottage. 2 hours later, Timothy Lanigan and Catherine Luby were seized with violent illness. Both would die from what physicians identified as arsenic poisoning. The evidence pointing to Henrietta Robinson was gathered quickly. Mrs. Lanigan gave a detailed account of what had happened at the table. A local druggist confirmed that he had recently sold arsenic to a woman matching her description. A search of Henrietta's cottage found arsenic there. She was arrested. At trial, the prosecution would offer a motive. She had been thrown out of the bar that morning, and for someone in her state of mind, that was reason enough. The defense would call this insufficient. The jury, ultimately, would side with the prosecution. Both may have been right and wrong at the same time. The bar ejection explains the timing. It does not explain why Timothy Lanigan and Catherine Luby were the ones who died. That answer, if Henrietta Robinson ever had it, stayed with her. Henrietta Robinson was arrested in the days following the deaths of Timothy Lanigan and Catherine Luby. The evidence against her was straightforward. The witnesses were available. The physical evidence had been collected. In a case of this clarity, a formal indictment could have been expected within weeks. 9 months passed before it came. The indictment was filed in February 1854. The trial did not begin until May of that year, nearly a full year after the crime. The people of Troy watched the calendar and drew conclusions. In a city of that size, a year-long delay in a murder case with clear evidence meant one thing. Someone with influence was working the machinery on her behalf. The delays left a widespread impression that powerful forces were operating behind the scenes to protect her, or at minimum, to slow the proceedings until public attention moved elsewhere. It did not move elsewhere. In July of 1854, while awaiting trial, Henrietta Robinson attempted suicide by drinking vitriol, a caustic acid. She survived. The question of how she had obtained a corrosive poison inside a prison was never publicly answered. Speculation ran in one direction, that whatever forces were protecting her in the courts preferred her death in prison to a public hearing in which she might speak, or in which her identity might be established under oath. It is worth being precise about what powerful forces meant in practice. No individual was ever named. No mechanism was ever exposed. What exists is a pattern: the delay, the failed suicide, the eventual commutation. That the people of Troy, and much of the American press covering the case, read as the signature of money and influence operating on her behalf. Whether that reading was accurate, or whether it was the kind of story a city tells itself when a case moves slowly, is not something the historical record resolves. What it does record is that Henrietta Robinson was still alive when the trial finally opened, that she was defended by capable attorneys, and that she arrived in court with a plan. The trial of Henrietta Robinson opened on May 22, 1854, in Troy. Spectators had come from across the city and beyond it. The case had been covered in newspapers from New York to Montreal. People wanted to see the woman at the center of it. From the first morning, her face was covered by a dense black veil. When witnesses were called to identify her, she would lift it briefly, for the witness alone, and only long enough for the identification to be made. Then she lowered it again. The spectators in the gallery saw nothing throughout the proceedings. On the third day of the trial, the judge issued an order. Henrietta Robinson was to remove the veil or face a charge of contempt of court. Her attorneys carried the response back to the bench. She would submit to whatever punishment was required before she would remove it. The judge relented. She wore the veil for the remainder of the trial. It is worth pausing on what happened in that exchange. A sitting judge, with full authority over the defendant, issued a direct order. The defendant refused. The judge chose not to enforce it. The reasons for his retreat were not recorded, but the result was unambiguous. In the first direct confrontation between the court's authority and Henrietta Robinson's will, she won. The defense argued insanity. Her history of paranoid episodes, her erratic behavior, her documented instability, all pointed, they said, to a mind that could not be held responsible for its actions. The prosecution countered that drunkenness is not insanity and does not constitute a legal defense. For a person in her condition, they argued, being thrown out of a bar was motive enough. The jury deliberated. They convicted her of first-degree murder. Upon hearing the verdict read, she stood up. She declared that there was corruption in the court, that there was corruption in the judge, that shame belonged to all of them. The veil remained in place throughout. As the trial drew national attention, newspapers across the United States and Canada ran competing accounts of who Henrietta Robinson actually was. A paper in Quebec identified her as a woman named Campbell, who had operated a drinking house in the suburbs of the city and run off with a cab driver. A Troy paper reported that she was the daughter of a Dr. Robinson of Montreal, who had died in a lunatic asylum 9 years earlier. A paper in Albany claimed she was the daughter of an Irish gentleman of rank, disinherited after marrying the son of her father's steward. Each of these identifications had one thing in common. They explained her. They gave the veil a context, the erratic behavior a cause, the rootless life in Troy a backstory. A fallen woman, a disgraced daughter, a runaway. Any of these was more legible than what the trial itself had produced, which was a woman who refused to be placed anywhere on the social map. The most consequential identification came from Troy itself. A former student at the Troy Female Seminary recognized Henrietta as a classmate, a woman named Emma Wood, daughter of William F. Wood, a prominent and respectable citizen of Quebec. The Troy Times printed the story. Wood sued the paper for libel. His family published a formal denial. 4 of his 5 daughters had attended the seminary, but all were now married and living abroad in England, Ireland, and Scotland. The denial was categorical. The lawsuit was real. Neither fully closed the matter. In the period before her sentencing, Henrietta was reportedly recognized again, this time as Charlotte Wood, a different daughter from the same family. Many people accepted this identification. Henrietta Robinson never confirmed or denied it, or any of the others. What the identity parade revealed, more than any particular theory about her origins, was the discomfort produced by a woman no one could place. Every identification was an attempt to resolve that discomfort by assigning her to a known category: fallen aristocrat, fugitive wife, disinherited daughter. The veil frustrated every attempt. She remained, throughout, exactly what she had always been: a woman with a name that wasn't hers, in a city that had never fully known what to do with her. Appeals kept the case open for another year after the verdict. The defense sought a new trial. The request was denied. On June 14, 1855, Henrietta Robinson was brought into court for sentencing. The judge instructed her to raise the veil. She raised it. This requires some precision, because the distinction matters. The judge had ordered her to remove the veil on the third day of the trial, and she had refused outright. What happened at sentencing was not the same event. She raised the veil, not because the court had finally compelled her, but because she chose to. At the moment, the worst thing the court could do to her was about to be spoken aloud. For the first and only time in open court, her face was visible to the room. The sentence was read: death by hanging. The date set for August 3, 1855. Her attorneys immediately began the process of appeal to the governor. Citizens across New York State sent letters asking that her life be spared. There was wide sympathy, not necessarily for her guilt or innocence, but for the spectacle of a woman being hanged, and for the persistent sense that the full story of Henrietta Robinson had never been told in court. Before the execution date arrived, the governor of New York commuted her sentence to life imprisonment. The news was delivered to Henrietta Robinson. By every account available, she received it without relief. She had, in the months leading up to August, made her peace with what was coming. She had requested the sacraments. She had said her prayers. She was, as people who spoke with her reported it, fully prepared to die. The state of New York had other plans for her, and unlike the judge who had backed down over the veil, the governor's decision was not open to refusal. She had wanted to die on August 3, 1855. She did not die until May of 1905. In the 50 years between those two dates, she was processed through 3 institutions: Sing Sing Prison on the Hudson, where she spent 18 years; Auburn Prison in western New York, where she was transferred at some point after that; and finally, in 1890, the Matawan Hospital for the Criminally Insane in New Jersey, where she would spend the last 15 years of her life. The commutation was framed publicly as an act of mercy. Petitions had been signed. Citizens had appealed to the governor's conscience. The execution of a woman, whatever she had done, struck many as a thing that should not happen. What those citizens did not account for, or perhaps did not consider, was what Henrietta Robinson wanted. She had not petitioned for her life. She had not asked anyone to write to the governor on her behalf. She had arranged herself for death. The commutation arrived over her head, from a power she could not contest, and gave her 50 more years she had not requested. In a case that turned, in almost every dimension, on who held authority over Henrietta Robinson, the courts, the jury, the press, the public appetite for her face and her name, the commutation was the one exercise of power that completely defeated her. A judge had backed down over the veil. The governor did not back down over her life. She served the sentence. She did not, by any account in the institutional record, ever accept it as something she owed. She simply endured it, silently, for 50 years, because there was no other option available to her. The world that had convicted Henrietta Robinson moved on. The newspapers that had competed to identify her found other sensations to cover. The people of Troy who had watched the calendar during the 9-month delay aged and died. Timothy Lanigan's family dispersed. The Wood family of Quebec, whoever they were in relation to the defendant, continued their lives in England, Ireland, and Scotland. The judge who had backed down over the veil retired and died. The attorneys who had argued her case died. The jurors died. Henrietta Robinson remained. At Sing Sing, she was a prisoner among prisoners, with a name the institution had given her and a past the institution did not need to understand. At Auburn, the same. At Matawan, classified as criminally insane, a designation that, depending on who was making it and when, may have reflected genuine mental deterioration, or may simply have been the administrative category that fit a woman who had spent decades refusing to cooperate with any institutional attempt to know her. She was urged, periodically, to disclose her identity. By clergy, by staff, by curious officials who had heard the story and wanted to be the person who finally got the answer. She declined each time, in whatever manner she had available to her, by saying nothing or by saying something that clarified nothing. Hospital records at Matawan listed her age at her last birthday as 78. She told staff she was 89. The difference was 11 years. The reason for the discrepancy, whether she was confused or lying or had genuinely lost track of her own age across half a century of incarceration, was not recorded. It was, in its small way, consistent with everything else about her. Even the fact of how old she was remained contested territory, held by no one with certainty. In May of 1905, in the ward at Matawan, the clergyman asked one more time. She said nothing. She died within days. A brief notice ran in the New York Times on May 15, 1905, under the headline, "Veiled Murderess Dies with 50 Years Secret." The paper noted the commuted death sentence, the long institutional record, the failure of anyone to establish her true identity. It recorded that she had carried the secret to her grave. It ran a few column inches, and then the paper moved on to the next story, as papers do. What Henrietta Robinson had protected for 52 years is impossible to state with certainty. The Wood family identification remained the most credible theory available, but it was never confirmed. If she was Charlotte Wood, or Emma Wood, or neither, if she was the daughter of a Montreal doctor, or a Quebec cab driver's companion, or an Irish gentleman's disinherited child, none of those identities would have saved her in 1853 from the arsenic in her cottage and the druggist who had sold it to her. The veil did not protect her from conviction. It did not prevent the death sentence. It did not stop the commutation she had not wanted. What it did, with complete consistency across 52 years, was prevent anyone from deciding who she was on her behalf. Every institution she passed through assigned her a name. Every newspaper that covered her trial assigned her an identity. Every clergyman who sat with her at Matawan tried to assign her a soul with a history attached to it. She declined all of them. She died as she had lived in Troy, with a name that wasn't hers, in a room that wasn't her home, refusing to give anyone the thing they most wanted from her. That refusal was, in the end, the only thing she owned.